The city lights of New York sparkled like diamonds, casting long shadows over Jack Whitmore's towering penthouse. From the outside, he had it all: wealth, power, an empire that stretched across continents. But behind the cold steel and glass of his success, Jack was a man haunted by an emptiness no amount of money could fill. For years, he had been driven by ambition, believing that power would bring him fulfillment. But he had learned the hard way that power could not replace love, nor could wealth mend a broken heart. His ex-wife had made that painfully clear when she walked out on him the moment she learned he was infertile. She hadn't even tried to console him, to find another way. Instead, she had simply packed her designer bags, left her wedding ring on the marble counter, and said, "I didn't sign up for this." Jack had stood there, watching her leave, feeling his world shatter around him. He had never known what true loneliness felt like until that moment, but he was not the kind of man who begged. He did not plead for love. Instead, he buried himself in work, building an empire so powerful that no one could ever look down on him again. He told himself he didn't need anyone, that love was just a distraction. Yet despite all his efforts, one truth gnawed at him day and night. He wanted a child of his own, a child who would love him, not for his money, not for his power, but simply because he was their father. Doctors had assured him that he could still have a biological child through surrogacy, but finding the right woman was no easy task. He didn't want a socialite who saw this as an opportunity to get closer to his wealth. He needed someone with integrity, someone who wouldn't use the child as a pawn. Months passed, and despite his connections, no one felt right. Then one day his lawyer handed him a file. "I think I found her," the man said. Jack barely glanced at the folder. He had seen dozens of candidates and rejected them all. "What makes her different?" he asked, his voice edged with skepticism. "She's not in it for the money, at least not in the way you'd expect. She's desperate, but she's also selfless." Jack flipped open the file. The name at the top read Doris Carter. The photo attached showed a young woman with striking brown eyes and long dark hair. She looked nothing like the women in his world. There was no artificial perfection, no hint of gold digger ambition, just honesty. Intrigued, he read further. Doris was 24. She worked two jobs, one as a waitress, another as a caregiver at a small nursing home. Her background was heartbreaking: a sick mother, crippling medical bills, a life spent fighting against circumstances that never seemed to ease. Jack set the file down. For the first time, he felt something other than cold calculation. He felt something close to respect. The unusual proposition. The next day, his team arranged a meeting. Jack expected nerves, hesitation, maybe even fear. But when Doris entered his office, she stood tall, her chin lifted, her gaze steady. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Miss Carter." Jack studied her. She was different from anyone he had ever met. She didn't fawn over his wealth, nor did she seem intimidated by him. "Your lawyer told me about the offer," she continued. $1 million to carry your child." Jack nodded. "Yes. Everything will be handled medically. No intimacy required." Doris let out a small breath of relief, but her shoulders remained tense. "I won't lie, I never imagined myself doing something like this. But my mother, she needs surgery, and I don't have any other options." Jack admired her honesty. She wasn't pretending to be some noble savior. She was desperate, but she was still proud. "Then we have a deal?" he asked. She hesitated for a brief second before nodding. "On one condition." Jack raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" "I don't want any personal involvement beyond what's necessary. No interviews about my past, no unnecessary interactions. This is a business agreement, nothing more." For some reason, that condition bothered him. Most women he knew would jump at the chance to get close to him, but she wanted nothing to do with him outside of the contract. "Understood," he said, masking his curiosity. "My staff will arrange everything." As Doris stood to leave, Jack watched her carefully. Something about her intrigued him. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't trying to impress him, manipulate him, or charm him. And yet, as she walked out of his office, he had the strangest feeling. This woman, this nobody from a world so different from his own, would change his life forever. Doris stood in the doorway of her new room, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and fear. The walls were painted in soft ivory, the floor covered in plush carpeting that swallowed the sound of her footsteps. A grand window overlooked the city, twinkling with millions of lights. So different from the cramped apartment she had lived in all her life. She should have felt relieved. After years of scraping by, after endless nights worrying about medical bills, she was finally in a place where survival wasn't a daily battle. But instead of comfort, all she felt was loneliness. The mansion was eerily quiet, its vastness making her feel smaller than ever. She had expected something different, perhaps warmth, maybe even kindness from the man whose child she was supposed to carry. But Jack Whitmore was nothing like she imagined. He was cold, distant, a man made of steel and shadows. From the moment she signed the contract, he barely acknowledged her presence. He had assigned a personal assistant to handle all communication, and every time she caught a glimpse of him in the hallways, he merely nodded before disappearing into his world of business meetings and boardrooms. To him, she was nothing more than a means to an end, and she reminded herself that this was good. This was professional. No emotions, no attachments. She had no idea how quickly everything would change. The unexpected discovery weeks passed, and the process began. Medical evaluations, nutritional plans, careful monitoring. The doctors ensured that everything was perfect before proceeding with the next steps. Doris kept her head down, following every instruction without question. But then one evening, during a routine checkup, the atmosphere in the medical office shifted. The doctor, an older man with years of experience, glanced at her file, then back at the test results, his brows knitting together in confusion. Jack, who had been casually checking his watch, noticed the hesitation. "Is there a problem?" His voice was sharp, impatient. The doctor cleared his throat. "Not a problem, necessarily, but there's something you should know before we move forward." Doris, already on edge, felt a strange unease crawl up her spine. "What is it?" Jack demanded. The doctor adjusted his glasses and met Jack's gaze. "She's a virgin." Silence. Doris froze. Jack, who had been leaning against the desk, straightened, his jaw tightening. "That can't be right." "The tests confirm it," the doctor said calmly. "Doris has never been with a man before?" The words hung in the air like an unspoken secret finally exposed. Jack's mind raced. He had made assumptions about her, assumptions that, apparently, were completely wrong. He had believed she was just another woman making a calculated decision, a woman who had lived a full life, had relationships, had experiences. But this changed everything. He turned to Doris, expecting to see embarrassment or shame in her expression, but instead, she was simply looking down at her hands, her fingers twisted together. He had never seen her so vulnerable. "Why?" The word escaped before he could stop it. Doris flinched. "Why what? Why would someone like you agree to this? If you've never been with anyone before? Why now? Why this?" Doris felt a lump in her throat. She hated this, hated that he was looking at her like she was some kind of mystery to be solved. Taking a shaky breath, she finally spoke. "Because I needed the money," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My mother needs surgery. I can't afford it. This was my only way." Jack stared at her, his cold exterior faltering. "But why never? Why wait this long?" His voice was quieter now, less demanding. Doris swallowed hard. "Because I was always taking care of someone else. My mother. My little brother before he passed away. There was never time for anything else." She let out a humorless laugh. "And honestly, no one ever looked at me that way. I was always just the responsible one, the one who worked, who sacrificed. Romance was a luxury I could never afford." Jack felt something shift inside him. He had met countless women, had been with more than he could count. They were drawn to his power, his status. But Doris? She had given up everything for the people she loved, and now she was giving up something even more, just to save her mother. For the first time in years, Jack felt something other than control. He felt something for her. That night, he found himself standing outside her bedroom door. He didn't even know why. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something deeper, something he didn't dare name. He knocked once. A few seconds later, the door creaked open, and Doris appeared, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her expression guarded. "Jack?" She sounded surprised. He hesitated, then exhaled. "I just wanted to say, I understand now." She frowned. "Understand what?" "You," he admitted. Doris looked away. "That doesn't change anything. This is still just a contract." Jack nodded, but deep down, he knew something had changed. And no matter how much he tried to ignore it, no matter how much he reminded himself that this was just business, he couldn't shake the feeling that Doris Carter was about to change his life in ways he never saw coming. The days inside Jack Whitmore's mansion passed in a strange, unspoken rhythm. At first, Doris kept her distance, reminding herself that she was only here for the contract, nothing more. But as time went on, the boundaries between them began to blur in ways she never anticipated. Jack, the cold-hearted millionaire, the man who had barely spared her a glance in the beginning, was changing. And the most terrifying part, so was she. One evening, as the golden sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, Doris wandered into the garden. It had become her favorite escape, a small sanctuary in a world that wasn't hers. She knelt beside the roses, carefully watering them, her fingers brushing against the delicate petals. She didn't notice Jack standing a few feet away, watching her. For a man who had spent his life surrounded by luxury, by women adorned in diamonds and designer dresses, the sight before him was oddly mesmerizing. Doris, in a simple cotton dress, barefoot in the grass, her hair loose in the evening breeze, looked more beautiful than any woman he had ever known. "Why do you like flowers so much?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence. Doris turned, startled by his presence. She hadn't heard him approach. A soft smile played on her lips. "Because they remind me that even in the worst conditions, life can still bloom." Jack's chest tightened at her words. He had faced hardships too. He had been betrayed, abandoned, left to rebuild his life from nothing. But never once had he thought to see life the way she did. For him, struggles had always been battles to win. But to Doris, struggles were just storms that made the flowers stronger. For the first time in years, Jack felt something shift inside him. Admiration, respect, maybe even something deeper. Days turned into weeks, and Doris became more than just the woman carrying his child. Jack found himself waiting for moments to see her, to hear her voice. Their conversations, once cold and distant, became personal. He learned that she loved old books, the kind with yellowed pages and stories that made her believe in hope. That she hated thunderstorms but loved the smell of rain. That she used to sing to her little brother when he was scared at night. And she learned that Jack Whitmore, the ruthless businessman, had once dreamed of being an artist before life had forced him to take another path. One night, he caught her humming softly in the library, her fingers tracing the spine of an old book. "You sing?" Jack asked from the doorway. Doris turned, startled. "Only when no one is listening." Jack smirked. "I was listening." For the first time, she blushed. Something unspoken passed between them in that moment, a connection neither of them had expected. But just as they were growing closer, reality came crashing in. One night, Jack was in his study when he heard muffled sobs coming from down the hall. Frowning, he followed the sound to the library. There, curled up in the corner, was Doris. Her shoulders trembled as she pressed her face into her hands, her body shaking with quiet cries. Jack's chest tightened. He had seen people cry before. Businessmen who had lost everything, enemies who had begged for mercy. But this was different. This wasn't a woman crying over money or failure. This was a woman breaking under the weight of something far greater. Without thinking, he stepped forward. "What's wrong?" His voice was softer than he had ever meant it to be. Doris wiped at her tears, struggling to compose herself. "My mother. She needs the surgery sooner. The doctors said they can't wait anymore. But I don't have enough yet." Her voice cracked, and something inside Jack snapped. He clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. Without a word, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Doctor," he said, his tone firm, leaving no room for argument. "Schedule the surgery. I'll cover the full cost." Doris's head shot up. "Jack!" "It's done." She blinked at him, her lips parting in shock. You don't have to." "I want to," Jack interrupted. "I take care of what's mine." Her breath hitched. He wasn't just talking about the contract anymore. Doris saw it in his eyes and the way he looked at her. Not as a stranger, not as a business deal, but as something more, as someone who mattered. That night, Doris couldn't sleep. She lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart pounding. Jack Whitmore was an enigma. He was ruthless, powerful, and yet he had done something no one had ever done for her before. He had cared, not because he had to, not because it benefited him, but because he wanted to. And as much as she tried to ignore it, to push it away, she couldn't deny it anymore. Jack wasn't just a cold-hearted businessman. He had a heart, and slowly, ever so slowly, it was opening for her. It had started as nothing more than a contract, a temporary arrangement where emotions had no place. But now the grand halls, the marble floors, the towering walls, they all held memories, soft smiles, late-night conversations, glimpses of something she never thought she would find in a man like Jack Whitmore. And worst of all, her heart was beginning to betray her. The sky rumbled, dark clouds rolling over the city as lightning sliced through the heavens. Doris sat on the edge of her bed, hugging her knees. She hated thunderstorms, not just because of the sound, but because they reminded her of all the nights she had spent alone as a child, trembling in the dark, with no one to comfort her. Then, as if to mock her, the mansion was plunged into darkness. Her breath hitched. The shadows in the room stretched unnaturally, making her feel trapped, suffocated. She tried to steady her breathing, but her body refused to listen. A knock at the door made her jump. "Doris!" It was him. Jack's voice was calm, but she could hear the concern beneath it. She wanted to tell him she was fine, that she wasn't scared. But when another clap of thunder shook the house, she couldn't stop the shudder that ran through her. Jack didn't wait for an answer. He stepped inside and found her curled up in the corner, her arms wrapped around herself. His chest tightened. Without thinking, he crossed the room and knelt in front of her. "It's just a storm," he murmured, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Doris squeezed her eyes shut. "I know," but her body was still trembling. Jack hesitated for only a second before making a decision he never would have made months ago. He pulled her into his arms. At first she stiffened, but then she melted into him. She buried her face in his chest, gripping his shirt as if he were the only thing keeping her grounded. His warmth, his scent, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, it drowned out the storm outside. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then in a whisper so quiet he almost didn't hear it, she said, "I don't know why, but I feel safe with you." Jack's grip on her tightened. His heart pounded in a way it never had before. He wasn't the kind of man who offered comfort. He wasn't the kind of man who held someone just to make them feel safe. But right now he wasn't thinking about who he used to be. He was thinking about the woman in his arms. "Because you are," he murmured, and for the first time in his life, he meant it. The storm had passed by morning, but something had changed between them. Jack awoke to the scent of something unfamiliar wafting through the halls. He frowned, throwing on a shirt before following the smell downstairs. He stopped in the doorway of the kitchen, frozen. Doris stood by the stove, her hair still slightly damp from sleep, wearing one of his oversized sweaters. She flipped pancakes with an ease that made it seem like she had lived here forever. "What are you doing?" Jack asked, his voice hoarse. She turned and smiled, setting a plate down on the table. "Making breakfast." Jack hesitated. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to." He sat down, staring at the golden pancakes in front of him. No one had ever cooked for him before. Ever. Growing up, his parents had been too busy building their empire to bother with home-cooked meals. As an adult, he had chefs, assistants, people paid, to make sure his life ran smoothly. But this wasn't about money or duty. This was something else. He picked up his fork, taking a bite. Warm, sweet, comforting. For the first time in years, something inside him softened. No one has ever done this for me, he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. Doris watched him, her expression gentle. Then let me be the first. Jack looked up at her, and in that moment, he realized something terrifying. Doris wasn't just the woman carrying his child anymore. She was the woman who was changing everything he thought he knew about himself. And no matter how hard he tried to fight it, he was falling for her. The days that followed the storm were some of the happiest Jack had known in years. Doris had become more than a presence in his house. She had become a part of his life. Her laughter echoed through the hallways, her warmth filled the once empty spaces, and her kindness softened the sharp edges of his world. He had spent his life believing love was nothing more than a weakness. But now with Doris, he realized it was the one thing that made him feel alive. And just when everything felt perfect, disaster struck. It was a crisp evening, the kind where the stars blanketed the sky and the air smelled of autumn. Doris had just finished setting the table for dinner when the doorbell rang. She glanced at Jack, who was seated on the couch, flipping through a business report. He frowned but stood up to answer the door. The moment he opened it, his expression darkened. "What the hell are you doing here?" Jack's voice was sharp, laced with anger. Doris stepped closer, curious. That was when she saw him. Lucas Grant, a man who had spent years trying to tear him down, both in business and in life. Lucas smirked, stepping inside as if he owned the place. "Relax, Whitmore. I just came to chat." His gaze shifted to Doris, and his smirk widened. "Ah, so this is the famous Doris." Doris stiffened, a strange unease creeping over her. "Leave," Jack growled. Lucas ignored him. He turned fully to Doris, his voice dripping with amusement. "Tell me, sweetheart, did he ever tell you the truth?" Doris frowned. "What truth?" Jack took a step forward, his jaw clenched. "Lucas, that you were just a contract?" Lucas finished. The room fell into a suffocating silence. Doris felt her heartbeat falter. I already know about the contract." Lucas chuckled. "Oh, darling, you know part of it, but not all." Jack's fists curled at his sides. "Get out." But Lucas wasn't done. "You see, sweetheart, Jack and I had a little bet." He paused, watching her reaction. "He told me no woman could resist him, that if he wanted someone, they'd fall at his feet. But you proved him wrong. He had to pay you to stay." Doris felt the blood drain from her face. "That's not true," she whispered. But Lucas just grinned. "Ask him yourself." Slowly she turned to Jack, her heart pounding. "Jack?" Her voice trembled. Jack's face was like stone, his eyes dark with fury, not at her, but at Lucas. "It was never a bet," he said, his voice low. "But you did pay me," Doris whispered. Jack exhaled sharply. "Yes, I did." Something inside Doris shattered. "So, I was just a transaction?" Jack's entire body tensed. You were never just that." She shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "But I was at first, wasn't I?" Jack stepped forward. "Doris, listen to me." "No," she whispered, stepping back. "I trusted you. She swallowed, her voice breaking. "I thought you cared about me. But this whole time, I was just a deal to you." Jack reached for her, but she flinched away. Something inside him cracked at the sight. "Doris, please." His voice was raw, desperate. "Let me explain." But she shook her head. "I need to go." Jack's stomach twisted. "Don't do this." She turned away, her hands trembling as she walked up the stairs. Lucas let out a low whistle. "Ouch! That had to hurt." Jack didn't hesitate. His fist connected with Lucas's jaw, sending him stumbling backward. "Get out!" Jack growled, his voice shaking with rage. Lucas wiped the blood from his mouth and smirked. "You should have told her the truth from the start." Then he walked out, leaving Jack standing there, fist clenched, heart pounding. That night Jack sat alone and she had packed her bags and walked out of his life without looking back. And for the first time in his existence, Jack Whitmore, who had conquered the business world, who had built an empire from nothing, felt utterly powerless. Because for the first time, money couldn't fix what was broken, and what was broken was him, his mansion. Doris had left. Days turned into weeks, and Jack's world seemed to crumble with every passing moment without Doris. The mansion felt cold, the halls echoing with emptiness. The scent of her perfume, the sound of her laughter, and the warmth she brought to his life were gone. Jack had spent his life building walls around himself, but Doris had torn them down. Now, with her absence, he was left to face the truth about who he had become and what he had lost. Jack couldn't let her go. He refused to. He had made mistakes, heart-wrenching ones. But one thing was clear. He would do whatever it took to fix it. He searched for Doris everywhere, every place she might go, cafes, hospitals, parks. He asked everyone who might know where she had gone. Yet no one seemed to have an answer. It was as if she had disappeared, vanished into the ether, leaving only the shattered pieces of his heart behind. But Jack was relentless. He wasn't going to give up on her, not after everything they had been through. And then, one fateful afternoon, he found her. It wasn't a grand place. It wasn't the luxurious boutique she had visited before, or the high-end shopping centers he used to frequent. It was a small, quaint bookstore, tucked away on a quiet street, the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. The smell of old books filled the air, and the gentle rustle of pages turning created a calming ambiance. Jack's heart skipped a beat when he saw her. Doris was standing behind the counter, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing a simple sweater and jeans. She was still as beautiful as ever, but the light in her eyes had dimmed. There was a sadness there, something that tore at his soul. She looked up, her eyes widening in shock as she saw him standing in the doorway. "What are you doing here?" Doris asked, her voice quiet, guarded. Jack stepped forward, his heart pounding. This was it. He had no more lies to tell, no more walls to hide behind. "I came to tell you the truth," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Doris's face softened, but she remained silent, waiting for him to speak. Jack took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He had to get this right. "At first you were just a contract," he confessed. "But then you became my heart." Tears welled up in Doris's eyes, her lips trembling as she fought to keep her composure. She didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes spoke volumes. She had been waiting for him to say this, but she didn't know if she could believe it. Jack stepped closer, his hands trembling with the weight of his feelings. "I don't care about the contract anymore," he continued. "I don't care about the money. All I care about is you." His voice cracked as the words tumbled out. "I love you, Doris." The room seemed to stand still, the air thick with the tension of his confession. Doris's hands trembled as she wiped away the tears that threatened to spill. "How do I know this isn't another deal?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. Jack's chest tightened. He could hear the doubt in her voice, the fear that had taken root in her heart. She had been burned by him once. Would she let him hurt her again? Without hesitation, Jack dropped to his knees in front of her, his eyes locked on hers. "Because for the first time in my life," he said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him, "I'm not offering money, I'm offering my heart." For a moment there was silence. Doris's breath caught in her throat, and Jack could see the internal battle waging inside her. She wanted to believe him, wanted to feel the love he was offering, but the scars from the past were still fresh. Then slowly, she took a step forward. And another. And then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, she fell into his arms. The world seemed to fall away, and for the first time in weeks, Jack felt whole. He held her like she was the most precious thing in the world because, to him, she was. "I love you too," Doris whispered, her voice muffled against his chest. Tears welled up in Jack's eyes as he pressed his lips to the top of her head, holding her tighter, never wanting to let her go. For all his wealth, his power, and his influence, nothing in the world mattered more than this moment. This love that had blossomed in the most unexpected of places. They stood there for what felt like hours, not needing words, just the quiet reassurance of each other's presence. In that moment, Jack understood something profound. Love wasn't about money. It wasn't about contracts or power or influence. Love was about giving yourself fully to another person, no matter the cost. It was about vulnerability, trust, and the willingness to fight for something real. Doris was no longer a transaction to him. She was the woman he had come to love deeply, and he would spend the rest of his life proving it to her. As they pulled away, Jack kissed her forehead softly. "I'm never letting you go again." Doris smiled through her tears, her heart finally at peace. "I believe you." And in that moment, they both knew that this was the beginning of a love that would withstand anything the world threw at them. It was a love worth fighting for.